Chapter 49 of the Mutiny of the Elsinore. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Mutiny of the Elsinore by Jack London, Chapter 49. The situation grows tense. There are no more seabirds, and the mutineers are starving. Yesterday I talked with Bert Rhine. Today I talked with him again, and he will never forget, I am certain, the little talk we had this morning. To begin with, last evening, at 5 o'clock, I heard his voice issuing from between the slits of the ventilator in the after wall of the chart house. Standing at the corner of the house, quite out of range, I answered him. "Getting hungry?" I jeered. "Let me tell you what we are going to have for dinner. I have just been down and seen the preparations. Now listen. First, caviar on toast, then clam bouillon, and creamed lobster, and tinned lamb chops with French peas. You know, the peas that melt in one's mouth. And California asparagus with mayonnaise. And, I forgot to mention fried potatoes, and cold pork and beans, and peach pie, and coffee, real coffee. Doesn't it make you hungry for your East Side? And say, think of the free lunch going to waste right now in 1,000 saloons in good old New York." I had told him the truth. The dinner I described, principally coming out of tins and bottles, to be sure, was the dinner we were to eat. "Got that," he snarled. "I want to talk business with you." "Right down to brass tacks," I jibed. "Very well. When are you and the rest of your rats going to turn to?" "Got that," he reiterated. "I've got you where I want you now. Take it from me, I'm giving it straight. I'm not telling you how, but I've got you under my thumb. When I come down on you, you'll crack." "Hell is full of cocksure rats like you," I retorted, although I never dreamed how soon he would be writhing in the particular hell preparing for him. "Forget it," he sneered back. "I've got you where I want you. I'm just telling you, that's all." "Pardon me," I replied, "when I tell you that I'm from Missouri. You'll have to show me." And as I thus talked, the thought went through my mind of how I naturally sought out the phrases of his own vocabulary in order to make myself intelligible to him. The situation was bestial, with 16 of our complement already gone into the dark, and the terms I employed, perforce, were terms of bestiality. And I thought, also, of I who was thus compelled to dismiss the dreams of the utopians, the visions of the poets, the king thoughts of the king thinkers, in a discussion with this ripened product of the New York inferno. To him I must talk in the elemental terms of life and death, of food and water, of brutality and cruelty. "I give you your choice," he went on. "Give in now, and you won't be hurt, none of you." "And if we don't?" I dared airily. "You'll be sorry you was ever born. You ain't a mushhead. You've got a girl there that's stuck on you. It's about time you think of her. You ain't altogether a mutt. You get my drive?" I did get it, and somehow across my brain flashed a vision of all I had ever read and heard of the siege of the legations at Peking, and of the plans of the white men for their womankind in the event of the yellow hordes breaking through the last lines of defense. And the old steward got it, for I saw his black eyes glint murderously in their narrow, tilted slits. He knew the drift of the gangster's meaning. "You get my drive?" the gangster repeated. And I knew anger. Not ordinary anger, but cold anger. And I caught a vision of the high places in which we had sat and ruled down the ages in all lands, on all seas. I saw my kind, our women with us, in forlorn hopes and lost endeavors, pent in hill fortresses, rotted in jungle fastnesses, cut down to the last one on the decks of the rocking ships. And always our women with us had we ruled the beasts. We might die, our women with us, but, living, we had ruled. It was a royal vision I glimpsed. Aye, and in the purple of it I grasped the ethic, which was the stuff of the fabric of which it was builded. It was the sacred trust of the seed, the bequest of duty handed down from all ancestors. And I flamed more coldly. It was not red brute anger. It was intellectual. It was based on concept and history. It was the philosophy of action of the strong, and the pride of the strong in their own strength. Now at last I knew Nietzsche. I knew the rightness of the books, the relation of the high thinking to high conduct, the transmutation of midnight thought into action in the high place of the poop of a coal carrier in the year 1913, my woman beside me, my ancestors behind me, my slant-eyed servitors under me, the beasts beneath me and beneath the heel of me. God, I felt kingly. I knew at last the meaning of kingship. My anger was white and cold. This subterranean rat of a miserable human, crawling through the bowels of the ship to threaten me and mine. A rat in the shelter of a knothole making a noise as beast-like as any rat ever made. And it was in this spirit that I answered the gangster. When you crawl on your belly along the open deck in the broad light of day, like a yellow cur that has been licked to obedience, and when you show by your every action that you like it and are glad to do it, then, and not until then, will I talk with you. Thereafter, for the next 10 minutes, he shouted all the Billingsgate of his kind at me through the slits in the ventilator. But I made no reply. I listened, and I listened coldly. And as I listened, I knew why the English had blown their mutinous sepoys from the mouths of cannon in India long years ago. And when, this morning, I saw the steward struggling with a 5-gallon carboy of sulfuric acid, I never dreamed the use he intended for it. In the meantime, I was devising another way to overcome that deadly ventilator shaft. The scheme was so simple that I was shamed in that it had not occurred to me at the very beginning. The slitted opening was small. 2 sacks of flour, in a wooden frame, suspended by ropes from the edge of the chart-house roof directly above, would effectually cover the opening and block all revolver fire. No sooner thought than done. Tom Spink and Lewis were on top the chart-house with me and preparing to lower the flour when we heard a voice issuing from the shaft. "Who's in there now?" I demanded. "Speak up." "I'm giving you a last chance," Bert Rhine answered. And just then, around the corner of the house, stepped the steward. In his hand he carried a large galvanized pail, and my casual thought was that he had come to get rainwater from the barrels. Even as I thought it, he made a sweeping half-circle with the pail and sloshed its contents into the ventilator opening. And even as the liquid flew through the air, I knew it for what it was. Undiluted sulfuric acid, 2 gallons of it from the carboy. The gangster must have received the liquid fire in the face and eyes. And in the shock of pain, he must have released all holds and fallen upon the coal at the bottom of the shaft. His cries and shrieks of anguish were terrible, and I was reminded of the starving rats which had squealed up that same shaft during the first months of the voyage. The thing was sickening. I prefer that men be killed cleanly and easily. The agony of the wretch I did not fully realize until the steward, his bare forearm sprayed by the splash from the ventilator slats, suddenly felt the bite of the acid through his tight, whole skin and made a mad dash for the water barrel at the corner of the house. And Bert Rhine, the silent man of soundless laughter, screaming below there on the coal, was enduring the bite of the acid in his eyes. We covered the ventilator opening with our flour device. The screams from below ceased as the victim was evidently dragged forward across the coals by his mates, and yet I confessed to a miserable forenoon. As Carlyle has said, death is easy, all men must die, but to receive 2 gallons of full-strength sulfuric acid full in the face is a vastly different and vastly more horrible thing than merely to die. Fortunately, Margaret was below at the time, and after a few minutes, in which I recovered my balance, I bullied and swore all our hands into keeping the happening from her. Oh well, and we have got ours in retaliation. Off and on, through all of yesterday, after the ventilator tragedy, there were noises beneath the cabin floor or deck. We heard them under the dining table, under the steward's pantry, under Margaret's stateroom. This deck is overlaid with wood, but under the wood is iron, or steel rather, such as of which the whole Elsinore is builded. Margaret and I, followed by Louis, Wada, and the steward, walked about from place to place, wherever the sounds arose of tapping and of cold chisels against iron. The tapping seemed to come from everywhere, but we concluded that the concentration necessary on any spot to make an opening large enough for a man's body would inevitably draw our attention to that spot. And, as Margaret said, if they do manage to cut through they must come up head first, and in such emergence, what chance would they have against us? So I relieved Buckwheat from deck duty, placed him on watch over the cabin floor, to be relieved by the steward and Margaret's watches. In the late afternoon, after prodigious hammerings and clangings in a score of places, all noise ceased. Neither in the first and second dog watches, nor in the first watch of the night, were the noises resumed. When I took charge of the poop at midnight, Buckwheat relieved the steward and the vigil over the cabin floor, and, as I leaned on the rail at the break of the poop, while my 4 hours dragged slowly by, least of all did I apprehend danger from the cabin, especially when I considered the 2-gallon pail of raw sulfuric acid ready to hand for the first head that might arise through an opening in the floor not yet made. Our rascals forward might scale the poop, or cross aloft from mizzenmast to jigger and descend upon our heads, but how they could invade us through the floor was beyond me. But they did invade. A modern ship is a complex affair. How was I to guess the manner of the invasion? It was 2 a.m, and for an hour I had been puzzling my head with watching the smoke arise from the after division of the forward house, and with wondering why the mutineers should have got up steam in the donkey engine at such an ungodly hour. Not on the whole voyage had the donkey engine been used. 4 bells had just struck, and I was leaning on the rail at the break of the poop when I heard a prodigious coughing and choking from aft. Next, Wada ran across the deck to me. "Big trouble with Buckwheat," he blurted at me. "You go quick." I shoved him my rifle and left him on guard while I raced around the chart house. A lighted match, in the hands of Tom Spink, directed me. Between the booby hatch and the wheel, sitting up and rocking back and forth with wringings of hands and waving of arms, tears of agony bursting from his eyes, was Buckwheat. My first thought was that in some stupid way he had got the acid into his own eyes. But the terrible fashion in which he coughed and strangled would quickly have undeceived me, had not Louis, bending over the booby companion, uttered a startled exclamation. I joined him, and one whiff of the air that came up from below made me catch my breath and gasp. I had inhaled sulfur. On the instant I forgot the Elsinore, the mutineers forward, everything save one thing. The next I know, I was down the booby ladder and reeling dizzily about the big after room as the sulfur fumes bit my lungs and strangled me. By the dim light of a sea lantern I saw the old steward, on hands and knees, coughing and gasping, the while he shook awake Yasuda, the first sailmaker. Uchino, the second sailmaker, still strangled in his sleep. It struck me that the air might be better nearer the floor, and I proved it when I dropped on my hands and knees. I rolled Uchino out of his blankets with a quick jerk, wrapped the blankets about my head, face, and mouth, arose to my feet, and dashed forward into the hall. After a couple of collisions with the woodwork, I again dropped to the floor and rearranged the blankets so that, while my mouth remained covered, I could draw or withdraw a thickness across my eyes. The pain of the fumes was bad enough, but the real hardship was the dizziness I suffered. I blundered into the steward's pantry and out of it, missed the cross hall, stumbled through the next starboard opening in the long hall, and found myself bent double by a violent collision with the dining-room table. But I had my bearings. Feeling my way around the table and bumping most of the poisoned breath out of me against the rotund-bellied stove, I emerged in the cross hall and made my way to starboard. Here, at the base of the chart-room stairway, I gained the hall that led aft. By this time my own situation seemed so serious that, careless of any collision, I went aft in long leaps. Margaret's door was open. I plunged into her room. The moment I drew the blanket thickness from my eyes, I knew blindness and a modicum of what Bert Rhine must have suffered. Oh, the intolerable bite of the sulfur in my lungs, nostrils, eyes, and brain. No light burned in the room. I could only strangle and stumble forward to Margaret's bed, upon which I collapsed. She was not there. I felt about, and I felt only the warm hollow her body had left in the undersheet. Even in my agony and helplessness, the intimacy of that warmth her body had left was very dear to me. Between the lack of oxygen in my lungs, due to the blankets, the pain of the sulfur, and the mortal dizziness in my brain, I felt that I might well cease there where the linen warmed my hand. Perhaps I should have ceased, had I not heard a terrible coughing from along the hall. It was new life to me. I fell from bed to floor, and managed to get upright until I gained the hall, where again I fell. Thereafter I crawled on hands and knees to the foot of the stairway. By means of the newel post I drew myself upright and listened. Near me something moved and strangled. I fell upon it and found in my arms all the softness of Margaret. How to describe that battle up the stairway? It was a crucifixion of struggle, an age-old nightmare of agony. Time after time, as my consciousness blurred, the temptation was upon me to cease all effort and let myself blur down into the ultimate dark. I fought my way step by step. Margaret was now quite unconscious, and I lifted her body step by step, or dragged it several steps at a time, and fell with it, and back with it, and lost much of that which had been so hardly gained. And yet out of it all this I remember, that warm soft body of hers was the dearest thing in the world, vastly more dear than the pleasant land I remotely remembered, than all the books and all the humans I had ever known, than the deck above, with its sweet pure air softly blowing under the cool starry sky. As I look back upon it, I am aware of one thing. The thought of leaving her there and saving myself never crossed my mind. The one place for me was where she was. Truly, this which I write seems absurd and purple, yet it was not absurd during those long minutes of the chart-room stairway. One must taste death for a few centuries of such agony ere he can receive sanction for purple passages. And as I fought my screaming flesh, my reeling brain, and climbed that upward way, I prayed one prayer, that the chart-house doors out upon the poop might not be shut. Life and death lay right there in that one point of the issue. Was there any creature of my creatures aft with common sense and anticipation sufficient to make him think to open those doors? How I yearned for one man, for one proved henchman, such as Mr. Pike, to be on the poop. As it was, with the sole exception of Tom Spink and Buckwheat, my men were Asiatics. I gained the top of the stairway, but was too far gone to rise to my feet. Nor could I rise upright on my knees. I crawled like any four-legged animal, nay, I wormed my way like a snake, prone to the deck. It was a matter of several feet to the doorway. I died a score of times in those several feet, but ever I endured the agony of resurrection and dragged Margaret with me. Sometimes the full strength I could exert did not move her, and I lay with her and coughed and strangled my way through to another resurrection. And the door was open. The doors to starboard and to port were both open, and as the Elsinore rolled a draught through the chart-house hall, my lungs filled with pure, cool air. As I drew myself across the high threshold and pulled Margaret after me, from very far away I heard the cries of men and the reports of rifle and revolver. And, ere I fainted into the blackness on my side, staring, my pain gone so beyond endurance that it had achieved its own anesthesia, I glimpsed, dreamlike and distant, the sharply silhouetted poop rail, dark forms that cut and thrust and smote, and, beyond the mizzen-mast, brightly lighted by our illuminators. Well, the mutineers failed to take the poop. My 5 Asiatics and 2 white men had held the citadel, while Margaret and I lay unconscious side by side. The whole affair was very simple. Modern maritime quarantine demands that ships shall not carry vermin that are themselves plague carriers. In the donkey engine section of the forward house is a complete fumigating apparatus. The mutineers had merely to lay and fasten the pipes aft across the coal, to chisel a hole through the double deck of steel and wood under the cabin, and to connect up and begin to pump. Buckwheat had fallen asleep and been awakened by the strangling sulfur fumes. We in the high place had been smoked out by our rascals like so many rats. It was Wada who had opened one of the doors. The old steward had opened the other. Together they had attempted the descent of the stairway and been driven back by the fumes. Then they had engaged in the struggle to repel the rush from forward. Margaret and I are agreed that sulfur, excessively inhaled, leaves the lungs sore. Only now, after a lapse of a dozen hours, can we draw breath in anything that resembles comfort. But still my lungs were not so sore as to prevent my telling her what I had learned she meant to me. And yet she is only a woman. I tell her so. I tell her that there are at least 750 million of two-legged, long-haired, gentle-voiced, soft-bodied female humans like her on the planet, and that she is really swamped by the immensity of numbers of her sex and kind. But I tell her something more. I tell her that of all of them she is the only one. And better yet, to myself and for myself, I believe it. I know it. The last least part of me and all of me proclaims it. Love is wonderful. It is the everlasting and miraculous amazement. Oh, trust me, I know the old, hard, scientific method of weighing and calculating and classifying love. It is a profound foolishness, a cosmic trick and quip to the contemplative eye of the philosopher. Yes, and of the futurist. But when one forsakes such intellectual flesh-pots and becomes mere human and male human, in short, a lover, then all he may do, and which is what he cannot help doing, is to yield to the compulsions of being, and throw both his arms around love, and hold it closer to him than is his own heart close to him. This is the summit of his life and of man's life. Higher than this no man may rise. The philosophers toil and struggle on molehill peaks far below. He who has not loved has not tasted the ultimate sweet of living. I know. I love Margaret, a woman. She is desirable. End of chapter 49. Chapter 50 of the Mutiny of the Elsinore. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Mutiny of the Elsinore by Jack London, Chapter 50. In the past 24 hours many things have happened. To begin with, we nearly lost the steward in the second dog watch last evening. Through the slits in the ventilator, some man thrust a knife into the sacks of flour and cut them wide open from top to bottom. In the dark the flour poured to the deck unobserved. Of course the man behind could not see through the screen of empty sacks, but he took a blind pot shot at point-blank range when the steward went by, slip-sloppily dragging the heels of his slippers. Fortunately it was a miss, but so close a miss was it that his cheek and neck were burned with powder grains. At 6 bells in the first watch came another surprise. Tom Spink came to me where I stood guard at the forward end of the poop. His voice shook as he spoke. "For the love of God, sir, they've come," he said. "Who?" I asked sharply. "Them," he chattered. "The ones that come aboard off the Horn, sir, the 3 drownded sailors. They're here, aft, sir, the 3 of them, standin' in a row by the wheel." "How did they get there?" "Bein' warlocks, they flew, sir. You didn't see 'em go by you, did you, sir?" "No," I admitted. "They never went by me." Poor Tom Spink groaned. "But there are lines aloft there on which they could cross over from mizzen to jigger," I added. "Send Wada to me." When the latter relieved me, I went aft. And there in a row were our 3 pale-haired storm waifs with the topaz eyes. In the light of a bull's-eye held on them by Louis, their eyes never seemed more like the eyes of great cats. And heavens, they purred. At least the inarticulate noises they made sounded more like purring than anything else. That these sounds meant friendliness was very evident. Also, they held out their hands, palms upward, in unmistakable sign of peace. Each in turn doffed his cap and placed my hand for a moment on his head. Without doubt this meant their offer of fealty, their acceptance of me as master. I nodded my head. There was nothing to be said to men who purred like cats, while sign language in the light of the bull's-eye was rather difficult. Tom Spink groaned protest when I told Louis to take them below and give them blankets. I made the sleep sign to them, and they nodded gratefully, hesitated, then pointed to their mouths and rubbed their stomachs. "Drowned men do not eat," I laughed to Tom Spink. "Go down and watch them. Feed them up, Louis, all they want. It's a good sign of short rations for'ard." At the end of half an hour Tom Spink was back. "Well, did they eat?" I challenged him. But he was unconvinced. The very quantity they had eaten was a suspicious thing, and, further, he had heard of a kind of ghost that devoured dead bodies in graveyards. Therefore, he concluded, mere not eating was no test for a ghost. The third event of moment occurred this morning at 7 o'clock. The mutineers called for a truce, and when Nosey Murphy, the Maltese Cockney, and the inevitable Charles Davis stood beneath me on the main deck, their faces showed lean and drawn. Famine had been my great ally. And in truth, with Margaret beside me in that high place at the break of the poop, as I looked down on the hungry wretches I felt very strong. Never had the inequality of numbers fore and aft been less than now. The 3 deserters, added to our own 9, made 12 of us, while the mutineers, after subtracting Ditman Olenson, Bob, and the Fawn, totaled only an even score. And of these Bert Rhine must certainly be in a bad way, while there were many weaklings such as Sundry Byers, Nancy, Larry, and Lars Jacobson. "Well, what do you want?" I demanded. "I haven't much time to waste. Breakfast is ready and waiting." Charles Davis started to speak, but I shut him off. "I'll have nothing out of you, Davis. At least not now. Later on, when I'm in that court of law you've bothered me with for half the voyage, you'll get your turn at talking. And when that time comes, don't forget that I shall have a few words to say." Again he began, but this time was stopped by Nosey Murphy. "Ah, shut your trap, Davis," the gangster snarled, "or I'll shut it for you." He glanced up at me. "We want to go back to work, that's what we want." "Which is not the way to ask for it," I answered. "Sir," he said hastily. "That's better," I commented. "Oh, my God, sir, don't let 'em come aft," Tom Spink muttered hurriedly in my ear. "That'd be the end of all of us. And even if they didn't get you and the rest, they'd heave me over some dark night. They ain't never going to forgive me, sir, for joining in with the afterguard." I ignored the interruption and addressed the gangster. "There's nothing like going to work when you want to as badly as you seem to. Suppose all hands get sail on her just to show good intention." "We'd like to eat first, sir," he objected. "I'd like to see you setting sail first," was my reply, "and you may as well get it from me straight that what I like goes aboard this ship." I almost said hooker. Nosey Murphy hesitated and looked to the Maltese Cockney for counsel. The latter debated, as if gauging the measure of his weakness while he stared aloft at the work involved. Finally he nodded. "All right, sir," the gangster spoke up. "We'll do it. But can't something be cooking in the galley while we're doing it?" I shook my head. "I didn't have that in mind, and I don't care to change my mind now. When every sail is stretched and every yard braced, and all that mess of gear cleared up, food for a good meal will be served out. You needn't bother about the spanker nor the mizzen braces. We'll make your work lighter by that much." In truth, as they climbed aloft, they showed how miserably weak they were. There were some too feeble to go aloft. Poor Sundry Buyers continually pressed his abdomen as he toiled around the deck capstans, and never was Nancy's face quite so forlorn as when he obeyed the Maltese Cockney's command and went up to loose the mizzen skysail. In passing, I must note one delicious miracle that was worked before our eyes. They were hoisting the mizzen upper topsail yard by means of one of the patent deck capstans. Although they had reversed the gear so as to double the purchase, they were having a hard time of it. Lars Jacobson was limping on his twice-broken leg, and with him were Sundry Buyers, Tony the Greek, Bombini, and Mulligan Jacobs. Nosey Murphy held the turn. When they stopped from sheer exhaustion, Murphy's glance chanced to fall on Charles Davis, the one man who had not worked since the outset of the voyage, and who was not working now. "Bear a hand, Davis," the gangster called. Margaret gurgled low laughter in my ear as she caught the drift of the episode. The sea lawyer looked at the other in amazement ere he answered, "I guess not." After nodding Sundry Buyers over to him to take the turn, Murphy straightened his back and walked close to Davis, then said very quietly, "I guess yes." That was all. For a space neither spoke. Davis seemed to be giving the matter judicial consideration. The men at the capstan panted, rested, and looked on, all save Bombini, who slunk across the deck until he stood at Murphy's shoulder. Under such circumstances, the decision Charles Davis gave was eminently the right one, although even then he offered a compromise. "I'll hold the turn," he volunteered. "You'll lump around one of them capstan bars," Murphy said. The sea lawyer made no mistake. He knew in all absoluteness that he was choosing between life and death, and he limped over to the capstan and found his place. And as the work started, and as he toiled around and around the narrow circle, Margaret and I shamelessly and loudly laughed our approval. And our men stole forward along the poop to peer down at the spectacle of Charles Davis at work. All of which must have pleased Nosey Murphy, for, as he continued to hold the turn and coil down, he kept a critical eye on Davis. "More juice, Davis," he commanded with abrupt sharpness, and Davis, with a startle, visibly increased his efforts. This was too much for our fellows who, Asiatics and all, applauded with laughter and hand-clapping. And what could I do? It was a gala day, and our faithful ones deserved some little recompense of amusement. So I ignored the breach of discipline and of poop etiquette by strolling away aft with Margaret. At the wheel was one of our storm waifs. I set the course due east for Valparaiso and sent the steward below to bring up sufficient food for one substantial meal for the mutineers. "When do we get our next grub, sir?" Nosey Murphy asked, as the steward served the supplies down to him from the poop. "At midday," I answered, "and as long as you and your gang are good, you'll get your grub 3 times each day. You can choose your own watches any way you please. But the ship's work must be done, and done properly. If it isn't, then the grub stops." "That will do. Now go forward." "One thing more, sir," he said quickly. "Bert Rhine is awful bad. He can't see, sir. It looks like he's going to lose his face. He can't sleep. He groans all the time." It was a busy day. I made a selection of things from the medicine chest for the acid-burn gangster, and, finding that Murphy knew how to manipulate a hypodermic syringe, entrusted him with one. Then, too, I practiced with the sextant, and think I fairly caught the sun at noon and correctly worked up the observation. But this is latitude, and is comparatively easy. Longitude is more difficult, but I am reading up on it. All afternoon a gentle northerly fan of air snored the Elsinore through the water at a 5-knot clip, and our course lay east for land, for the habitation of man, for the law and order that men institute whenever they organize into groups. Once in Valparaiso, with police flag flying, our mutineers will be taken care of by the shore authorities. Another thing I did was to rearrange our watches aft so as to split up the 3 storm visitors. Margaret took one in her watch along with the 2 sailmakers, Tom Spink and Lewis. Lewis is half white and all trustworthy, so that, at all times, on deck or below, he is told off to the task of never letting the topaz-eyed one out of his sight. In my watch are the steward, Buckwheat, Wada, and the other 2 topaz-eyed ones. And to one of these Wada is told off, and to the other is assigned the steward. We are not taking any chances. Always, day and night, on duty or off, these storm strangers will have one of our proved men watching them. Yes, and I tried the stranger men out last evening. It was after a council with Margaret. She was sure, and I agreed with her, that the men forward are not blindly yielding to our bringing them in to be prisoners in Valparaiso. As we tried to forecast it, their plan is to desert the Elsinore and the boats as soon as we fetch up with the land. Also, considering some of the bitter lunatic spirits forward, there would be a large chance of their drilling the Elsinore's steel sides and scuttling her ere they took to the boats. For scuttling a ship is surely as ancient a practice as mutiny on the high seas. So it was at 1 in the morning that I tried out our strangers. 2 of them I took forward with me in the raid on the small boats. One I left beside Margaret, who kept charge of the poop. On the other side of him stood the steward with his big hacking knife. By signs I had made it clear to him, and to his 2 comrades who were to accompany me forward, that at the first sign of treachery he would be killed. And not only did the old steward, with signs emphatic and unmistakable, pledge himself to perform the execution, but we were all convinced that he was eager for the task. With Margaret I also left Buckwheat and Tom Spink. Wada, the 2 sailmakers, Lewis, and the 2 topaz-eyed ones accompanied me. In addition to fighting weapons, we were armed with axes. We crossed the main deck unobserved, gained the bridge by way of the midship house, and by way of the bridge gained the top of the forward house. Here were the first boats we began work on, but first of all I called in the lookout from the forecastle head. He was Mulligan Jacobs, and he picked his way back across the wreck of the bridge where the fore-topgallant yard still lay, and came up to me unafraid, as implacable and bitter as ever. "Jacobs," I whispered, "you are to stay here beside me until we finish the job of smashing the boats. Do you get that?" As though it could frighten me, he growled all too loudly. "Go ahead for all I care. I know your game. And I know the game of the hell's maggots under our feet this minute. 'Tis they that'd desert in the boats. 'Tis you that'll smash the boats and jail 'em kit and crew." "Shh," I vainly interpolated. "What of it?" he went on as loudly as ever. "They're sleeping with full bellies. The only night watch we keep is the lookout. Even Rhine's asleep. A few jolts of the needle has put a clapper to his eternal moaning. Go on with your work. Smash the boats. 'Tis nothin' I care. 'Tis well I know my own crooked back is worth more to me than the necks of the scum of the world below there." "If you felt that way, why didn't you join us?" I queried. "Because I like you no better than them, and not half so well. They're what you and your fathers have made 'em. And who in hell are you and your fathers? Robbers of the toil of men. I like them little, I like you and your fathers not at all. Only I like myself and me crooked back that's a livin' proof there ain't no God and makes Browning a liar. "Join us now," I urged, meeting him in his mood. "It will be easier for your back." "To hell with you," was his answer. "Go ahead and smash the boats. You can hang some of them, but you can't touch me with the law. 'Tis me that's a crippled creature of circumstance, too weak to raise a hand against any man. A feather blown about by the windy contention of men strong in their back and brainless in their heads." "As you please," I said. "As I can't help pleasin'," he retorted, "bein' what I am and so made for the little flash between the darknesses which men call life. And why couldn't I a been the butterfly, or a fat pig in a full trough, or a mere mortal man with a straight back and women to love me? Go on and smash the boats. Play hell to the top of your bent. Like me, you'll end in the darkness. And your darkness'll be as dark as mine." "A full belly puts the spunk back into you," I sneered. "'Tis on an empty belly that the juice of my dislike turns to acid. Go on and smash the boats." "Whose idea was the Sulfur?" I asked. "I'm not tellin' you the man, but I envied him until it showed failure. And whose idea was it to douse the Sulfuric into Rhine's face? He'll lose that same face from the way it's shutting." "Nor will I tell you," I said, "though I will tell you that I am glad the idea was not mine." "Oh, well," he muttered cryptically, "different customs on different ships, as the cook said when he went forward to cast off the spanker sheet." Not until the job was done and I was back on the poop did I have time to work out the drift of that last figure in its terms of the sea. Mulligan Jacobs might have been an artist, a philosophic poet, had he not been born crooked with a crooked back. And we smashed the boats. With axes and sledges it was an easier task than I had imagined. On top of both houses we left the boats masses of splintered wreckage, the topaz-eyed ones working most energetically, and we regained the poop without a shot being fired. The forecastle turned out, of course, at our noise, but made no attempt to interfere with us. And right here I register another complaint against the sea novelists. A score of men forward, desperate all, with desperate deeds behind them, and jail and the gallows facing them not many days away, should have only begun to fight. And yet this score of men did nothing while we destroyed their last chance for escape. "But where did they get the grub?" the steward asked me afterwards. This question he's asked me every day since the first day Mr. Pike began cudgeling his brains over it. I wondered, had I asked Mulligan Jacobs the question, if he would have told me. At any rate, in court at Valparaiso that question will be answered. In the meantime I suppose I shall submit to having the steward ask me it daily. "It is murder and mutiny on the high seas," I told them this morning, when they came aft in a body to complain about the destruction of the boats and to demand my intentions. And as I looked down upon the poor wretches from the break of the poop, standing there in the high place, the vision of my kind down all its mad, violent, and masterful past was strong upon me. Already, since our departure from Baltimore, 3 other men, masters, had occupied this high place and gone their way. The Samurai, Mr. Pike, and Mr. Mellaire. I stood there, 4th, no seaman, merely a master by the blood of my ancestors, and the work of the Elsinore in the world went on. Bert Rhine, his head and face swathed in bandages, stood there beneath me, and I felt for him a tingle of respect. He, too, in a subterranean, ghetto way was master over his rats. Nosey Murphy and Kid Twist stood shoulder to shoulder with their stricken gangster leader. It was his will, because of his terrible injury, to get into land and doctors as quickly as possible. He preferred taking his chance in court against the chance of losing his life, or, perhaps, his eyesight. The crew was divided against itself, and Isaac Chance, the Jew, his wounded shoulder with a hunch to it, seemed to lead the revolt against the gangsters. His wound was enough to convict him in any court, and well he knew it. Beside him, and at his shoulders, clustered the Maltese Cockney, Andy Fay, Arthur Deacon, Frank Fitzgibbon, Richard Giller, and John Hackey. In another group still allegiant to the gangsters were men such as Shorty, Sorensen, Lars Jacobson, and Larry. Charles Davis was prominently in the gangster group. A fourth group was composed of Sundry Byers, Nancy, and Tony the Greek. This group was distinctly neutral. And finally, unaffiliated, quite by himself, stood Mulligan Jacobs, listening, I fancy, to far echoes of ancient wrongs, and feeling, I doubt not, the bite of the iron-hot hooks in his brain. "What are you going to do with us, sir?" Isaac Chance demanded of me, in defiance to the gangsters who were expected to do the talking. Bert Rhine lurched angrily toward the sound of the Jew's voice. Chance's partisans drew closer to him. "Jail you," I answered from above, "and it shall go as hard with all of you as I can make it hard." "Maybe you will and maybe you won't," the Jew retorted. "Shut up, Chance," Bert Rhine commanded. "And you'll get yours, you wop," Chance snarled, "if I have to do it myself." I am afraid that I am not so successfully the man of action that I have been priding myself on being, for, so curious and interested was I in observing the moving drama beneath me, that for the moment I failed to glimpse the tragedy into which it was culminating. "Bombini," Bert Rhine said. His voice was imperative. It was the order of a master to the dog at heel. Bombini responded. He drew his knife and started to advance upon the Jew. But a deep rumbling, animal-like in its sound and menace, arose in the throats of those about the Jew. Bombini hesitated and glanced back across his shoulder at the leader, whose face he could not see for bandages, and who he knew could not see. "'Tis a good deed. Do it, Bombini," Charles Davis encouraged. "Shut your face, Davis," came out from Bert Rhine's bandages. Kid Twist drew a revolver, shoved the muzzle of it first into Bombini's side, then covered the men about the Jew. Really, I felt a momentary twinge of pity for the Italian. He was caught between the millstones. "Bombini, stick that Jew," Bert Rhine commanded. The Italian advanced a step, and, shoulder to shoulder, on either side, Kid Twist and Nosey Murphy advanced with him. "I cannot see him," Bert Rhine went on, "but by God I will see him." And so speaking, with one single, virile movement, he tore away the bandages. The toll of pain he must have paid is beyond measurement. I saw the horror of his face, but the description of it is beyond the limits of any English I possess. I was aware that Margaret, at my shoulder, gasped and shuddered. "Bombini, stick him," the gangster repeated, "and stick any man that raises a yap. Murphy, see that Bombini does his work." Murphy's knife was out and at the bravo's back. Kid Twist covered the Jew's group with his revolver, and the three advanced. It was at this moment that I suddenly recollected myself and passed from dream to action. "Bombini," I said sharply. He paused and looked up. "Stand where you are," I ordered, "till I do some talking. Chance, make no mistake. Rhine is boss forward. You take his orders. Until we get into Valparaiso, then you'll take your chances along with him in jail. In the meantime, what Rhine says goes. Get that and get it straight. I am behind Rhine until the police come on board. Bombini, do whatever Rhine tells you. I'll shoot the man who tries to stop you. Deacon, stand away from Chance. Go over to the fife rail." All hands knew the stream of lead my automatic rifle could throw, and Arthur Deacon knew it. He hesitated barely a moment, then obeyed. "Fitzgibbon, Giller, Hackey," I called in turn, and was obeyed. "Fay," I called twice ere the response came. Isaac Chance stood alone, and Bombini now showed eagerness. "Chance," I said, "don't you think it would be healthier to go over to the fife rail and be good?" He debated the matter not many seconds, resheathed his knife, and complied. The tang of power. I was minded to let literature get the better of me and read the rascals a lecture, but thank heaven I had sufficient proportion and balance to refrain. "Rhine," I said. He turned his corroded face up to me and blinked in an effort to see. "As long as Chance takes your orders, leave him alone. We'll need every hand to work the ship in. As for yourself, send Murphy aft in half an hour, and I'll give him the best the medicine chest affords. That is all. Go forward." And they shambled away, beaten and dispirited. "But that man, his face, what happened to him?" Margaret asked of me. Sad it is to end love with lies. Sadder still it is to begin love with lies. I had tried to hide this one happening from Margaret, and I had failed. It could no longer be hidden save by lying, and so I told her the truth, told her how and why the gangster had had his face dashed with sulfuric acid by the old steward who knew white men and their ways. There is little more to write. The mutiny of the Elsinore is over. The divided crew is ruled by the gangsters, who are as intent on getting their leader into port as I am intent on getting all of them into jail. The first lap of the voyage of the Elsinore draws to a close. 2 days, at most, with our present sailing, will bring us into Valparaiso. And then, as beginning a new voyage, the Elsinore will depart for Seattle. One thing more remains for me to write, and then this strange log of a strange cruise will be complete. It happened only last night. I am yet fresh from it, in a thrill with it, and with the promise of it. Margaret and I spent the last hour of the second dog watch together at the break of the poop. It was good again to feel the Elsinore yielding to the wind pressure on her canvas, to feel her slipping and sliding through the water in an easy sea. Hidden by the darkness, clasped in each other's arms, we talked love and love plans. Nor am I ashamed to confess I was all for immediacy. Once in Valparaiso, I contended, we would fit out the Elsinore with fresh crew and officers and send her on her way. As for us, steamers and rapid traveling would fetch us quickly home. Furthermore, Valparaiso being a place where such things as licenses and ministers obtained, we would be married ere we caught the fast steamers for home. But Margaret was obdurate. The Wests have always stood by their ships, she urged, had always brought their ships into the ports intended, or had gone down with their ships in the effort. The Elsinore had cleared from Baltimore for Seattle with the Wests in the high place. The Elsinore would re-equip with officers and men in Valparaiso, and the Elsinore would arrive in Seattle with the West still on board. "But think, dear heart," I objected, "the voyage will require months. Remember what Henley has said, every kiss we take or give leaves us less of life to live." She pressed her lips to mine. "We kiss," she said. But I was stupid. "Oh, the weary, weary months," I complained. "You dear silly," she gurgled. "Don't you understand?" "I understand only that it is many 1,000 miles from Valparaiso to Seattle," I answered. "You won't understand," she challenged. "I am a fool," I admitted. "I am aware of only one thing. I want you. I want you." "You are a dear, but you are very, very stupid," she said, and as she spoke she caught my hand and pressed the palm of it against her cheek. "What do you feel?" she asked. "Hot cheeks, cheeks most hot." "I am blushing for what your stupidity compels me to say," she explained. "You have already said that such things as licenses and ministers obtained in Valparaiso, and, well—" "You mean?" I stammered. "Just that," she confirmed. "The honeymoon shall be on the Elsinore from Valparaiso all the way to Seattle?" I rattled on. "The many thousands of miles, the weary, weary months," she teased in my own intonations, until I stifled her teasing with my lips. Chapter 50 End of The Mutiny of the Elsinore by Jack London. The Mutiny of the Elsinore was narrated by Tom Crawford in Cool, California, USA, and proof listened by Sheila Mitchell in Nottinghamshire, England.